Well, hello to everyone who's joining and anyone who is going to be listening to the recording later. I am Marina, I'm the head of marketing here at Incendium, and on today's Growth Accelerator, we're very excited to have Elaine Chung with us. For anyone who does not know, Elaine is the founder and lead facilitator at Beyond the Change, and she's worked with countless leaders to help them empower them with essential tools to cultivate and sustain high performance individuals and teams because we're all about driving faster and more impactful results. So thank you so much, Elaine, for joining us today. And today's topic is going to be on becoming a growth leader. So I guess, Elaine, I'd love to hear your definition on what it means to be, a leader and specifically a growth leader.
Yeah. No, it's like being a leader, you think it's just like you're the person in charge, but it's so much more than that. Really instilling like and gravitating and grounding your team on what the mission is and really activating towards action. Because at the end of the day, a strategy, a plan can just sit there. And it
Mhm.
really is about the people to really activate and execute on it. And so a leader is really like a growth leader is really driving towards, okay, now we're done proof of concepting. We've kind of like navigated some of those basic approaches. Now, how do we actually really accelerate both on a revenue
Mm.
standpoint, whether it be like increasing users, but at the end of the day, too, you're actually growing your team at the same time. And there's some fundamental changes that do happen when you go from early stage where you're maybe just trying to test a concept out into the real world to then building a whole team and driving it forward and growing it exponentially.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, I guess, I imagine some of the changes that you referenced there are like people expect them, and I'm sure there's a lot of them that come as like huge surprises to people that they never see coming, and they don't really think about. So, kind of, what would you say are the top changes, and kind of which would you put in the surprising category versus the maybe people see this coming,
Yeah.
but it still helps to be prepared.
I love that question because I think what is expected, you're like, okay, because having been at large companies and also early stage, like Series A to Series E companies, um, largely you think like, okay, uh, we've our goals may have changed. So like as you're trying to grow, it's like, okay, we've got that proof of concept. We kind of done that market fit
Mhm.
examination. And yes, now we got to move towards acquiring more users or accounts. Like those are expected, right? Increased revenue.
Mhm.
But I think there's some fundamental parts that we forget about because you're like, okay, I just need to be very tactical. We need to reach these goals. We need to hit these numbers that we forget four switches that kind of happen. I kind of think of them like fundamental four things that are surprising that we don't
Mm.
recognize. One is like decision making. Two is really the knowledge flow. I'm happy to go into these more in depth too. Like the third one, I think also gets discounted and is surprising how much you have to focus in on is people dynamics
Mm.
too. And then process management, like going from singular to like now this whole network of individuals trying to work through it. I think those are the big surprising ones to me
Mhm.
that happen. Like, because I think back of some experiences like decision making, for example, like when you're early on, you're kind of like you just decide and then you try it. It might be just with your
Mhm.
co-founders, the core team, like, hey, I think we need to try to expand it this way. And that's you just move on with that decision and go.
Right.
But then as you grow and you've now included other team members with different expertise and know-how and experiences, you have to approach that decision making differently. It's less about like, okay, we're just gonna be direct and decide. There's a lot
Mhm.
more like proof and influence that you have to bake
Right.
in into being able to pull that decision together. And
Yeah.
even I would say like a surprising amount, even, like, when you start to really accelerate growth, like, the EQ side of it that you have to start integrating on a daily practice.
Yeah, it is so funny because there is such a transition. Like, Incendium is a growing company ourselves, and I've worked with other like kind of early stage companies or nonprofits and stuff that have some similarities. And there really is that like subtle to not so subtle shift that you notice in the air when the decision making power kind of goes
Yeah,
from extremely centralized to it starts to diffuse throughout the organization. And it's a real challenge to navigate of, yeah, letting it be a little bit less centralized and a little less quick than early stage, like super early stage companies are used to. So each of those kind of four transitions that you mentioned, I would love to hear you go into more detail about each one, because even just like on a, short little bite-sized like word or
Sure.
something that you offered, I was like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar to transitional like
Right,
things
right.
that come up.
Yeah, and we do discount. I think that's why for me, I've found like in my experiences, when those things break, that's when it's like really breaks. When it's like your team is really discouraged and you're also not seeing the results that you need. The team isn't like activating accounts fast enough, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
because of one of those four. And I think one of the other ones, when you talked about centralized decision making, and then it kind of being more spread out, it connects to that second fundamental, which is like knowledge flow. And to me, I've seen knowledge flow change both on the internal communications side of it, but also when you think about like customer research and feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So early on, it's like I'll start with the customer research and feedback. Like early on, it is a few customers, a handful of ones that are willing
Yeah.
to talk to you as you shape it, and you're like, okay, we're going to build towards that, and we're going to service towards that, and it gets you to a certain point. But when you actually really need to expand and accelerate, your N of one that was like equal to many, the math
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work anymore. You really
Right.
have to look at it in terms of like, all right, what's that next stage that beyond the early adopter? What are we servicing now? What do we have to build towards now? Because I have seen so many times of just building towards that very first few customer, and you pigeonhole yourself in a particular solution set, and you've built all these capabilities toward that without taking that next look of like, what is it that's going to be that pipeline growth that will really drive the growth, really drive um, the value within the
Mm-hmm.
company. And then it's like you have to go backwards a little bit within that, because we forgot, like, okay, we're not serving that one customer or that handful of customers. Really have to look outside within that. And then I would say on the communication standpoint, very early on, you've got your core set. Everybody's just kind of doing and knows what the vision is and is able to communicate that, because it's like physically just a handful of people.
Yeah.
And then as you increase the members, I often say it's like you have to know everybody learns and hears information differently. So you as the leader may think like you're repetitive, but you need to be because
Yeah.
your 5 times, that person may have only heard it once within that. And
Mm-hmm.
then just recognize that while you may think you're on repeat, you're not, but you're like you're reconfirming and solidifying and grounding everybody on what the mission is or what the goals are, and recognizing that people internalize and receive information differently. It's okay, like you can be on repeat, you can be on the slide, visual,
Mm-hmm.
verbal, talking it in meetings, and then ensuring that your leaders are also saying the same thing. It is repetition that's going to be helpful in that communication.
Yeah, I think that's so smart, because I think I'm not a founder, but what I have noticed from working with a lot of founders is that I think there's just a natural challenge to when you're so deep into something and you're so like your whole world to some degree becomes this. I think it can be difficult to like really understand what it's like for the people who work at your company. And the bigger your company gets, I imagine it becomes more like that, because maybe really, really early stage, your first few employees are going to have a very similar amount of like passion and drive, and maybe even some personality differences or similarities to
Mhm.
the person who started the company. But as you grow, you're going to like increase the diversity of buy-in and personalities, and like ways of just absorbing information, to your point, and knowledge. And yeah, the repetition, it really is
And it's okay. Yeah, you
necessary.
feel like you're on
Mhm.
repeat, but it's necessary. And I think, that one point you brought up, just like it can be in working with founders and founding teams, that experience that you had, it's because that company is a part of them. It's like such a strong identity
Yeah.
that, yeah, they can feel very, it's focused, but it's also
Mhm.
can put blinders on. So that's where it's like, for customer research, um, the how do I put this? Like, I been in the market research side of it, and it was
Hmm.
like you typically wouldn't put the engineer that made it for market research to ask the market research question because it's their
Yeah.
baby. You don't
Yeah.
want, they don't
Right.
want to hear any stuff. And then,
Yeah.
of course, you'd ask it and like, you like this, this new thing, right? And
Right.
so I think that that happens naturally because we want validation on the idea,
Hmm.
but to take it purely from a knowledge gathering standpoint, we have to kind of remove that side of it,
Yeah.
and to really become from just regular leader to actual growth leader, you do have to have the perspective then of on the customer standpoint, like really identifying like what are the needs of now and what the future are so that we can plan towards that, but also understanding that um, the way I learn and hear things isn't going to necessarily be the same for everybody now in that expanded team. I
Hmm.
Founders tend to collect within that, like, yes, the skill sets that they may not have, but general operating principles that are similar because there's already so much movement and to navigate that there's still some foundation. But as you expand further, you have less control over that,
Hmm.
and need to account for that.
Those are great points.
Yeah, and then that
So,
links to the people dynamics, right?
yeah.
Like you talked about that, and
Hmm.
where it's like before, um, you could rely on people that you knew well and deeply as a
Yeah.
founder, um, and and what ends up starting to happen is like, okay, now those people you're relying on them to hire for other areas and even other areas
Yeah.
that you no longer have the expertise necessarily done.
Hmm.
So then you're navigating the dynamics of like, um, it links back to communication side too and the
Yeah.
knowledge sharing. Like, how much do you really know? What decisions do you need to make? I think that's
Hmm.
some internal questions that a lot of leaders go through when that transition starts to happen is they still want to get involved with the nitty gritty,
Yeah.
but at the same time when we think about the time that is needed and then just how the company is expanding, it's really challenging to be effective, an
Yeah.
effective CEO, effective CTO, effective founder when you're deep into those parts. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's an uncomfortable process, I think, to relinquish that amount of,
Yes, yep,
decision making ability and control and all that kind of stuff. But to your point, like reinforcing to whatever degree is humanly possible within
yeah.
an organization of like, these are our values. This is what like we hire and fire around. This is what we reward. This is who we are, and getting the right people in the right seats kind of along the way
Yeah, I
so
think
that
that's
you can
yeah,
take your hand off the steering
yeah.
wheel a bit.
And you may still wanna kind of, like, get it back on, and that's okay.
Hmm.
I think that's just gonna be like it's already hard to let go even a little bit, so it'll just
Hmm.
be kind of as that team builds trust and those decisions. But I think for leaders just to be conscious that that is going on internally so that they're not acting blindly, because that can then diminish how your people can work, and I think that
Hmm.
is kind of the second component of the people dynamics. There's this whole, like, before you have this larger team and navigating all these different specialties, it's just more about like getting tasks done and driving actions like, okay, we got to just test this or like do this. Um, and and recognizing that it's not actually everybody's baby. Like they may have like the
Hmm.
cause and the mission,
Yeah.
but you really have to be clear on explaining that and communicating that to the vision, to the people, to the and connecting with the mission and the why. Like, why does it
Hmm.
matter for me as an employee? Because it won't be the same as and it will never. I think that's the part that it can be sometimes hard is that it's okay that it will never be the same feeling for an employee. Like, it will
Hmm.
never be
Right.
fully their baby, they dreamt it up and they created it. They do wanna be a part of something, but communicating what that something is very clearly from early on, and then when it's accelerating, like, being just as clear is so
Hmm.
important.
Yeah. It even makes me think like it's got to be an ongoing transitional process throughout the life cycle of a company, I would imagine, because when you're first starting, you have that like first crew of employees, and it's
Yeah,
like a ragtag startup team. And there's a certain personality type that can handle the
yeah,
volatility of working at an early stage like startup. And the more that company grows and becomes successful, my guess is that it introduces people who would never have probably survived at like the earliest stages of those companies, but who become a vital asset to the company as it does actually grow. And so there's probably like an ongoing process of learning to embrace a growing like pool of people who maybe like resemble the founder less and less over time, but who
Yeah.
contribute like to a much larger, much more established company, contribute like, extremely essential
Right.
dispositions and skill sets and all kinds of things.
Yeah, skill sets, knowledge, and
Mhm.
that happens. I actually was talking to a group of students today about how a lot of like if you started in a startup and then you get bought out and then you
Mhm.
get integrated into a large company, the longevity in which you stay actually is quite short as a like
Mm.
if you're used to and enjoy that early stage kind of
Yeah.
dynamic, and the all the rolling up the sleeves that you get to do and things like that.
Mhm.
I think that's a it's almost like a just like an environment that you choose to be in, but yeah, being
Yeah.
completely aware of is so important.
Mhm.
Um, and you're like when you get into growth mode, you are managing more people, right? You're like, it's not just like we're going to make a decision, we're going to test it out, test the business. Now it's much more about like you're a people manager and an
Yeah.
influencer more fully. And
Mhm.
I think personally for me, like that that's so important because the people like they put so much identity and time within the work that they
Mhm.
do. Um, and you know, they all have different reasons for being there. And as a leader, it's like tapping into that can really help you drive, productivity and
Mm.
getting the outcomes to know like, okay, like how can we grow the business, but also grow them? Because at the end of the day, like we still want to learn something. We still want to grow
Yeah.
somehow. Um, and I found this one fact that I thought was just so interesting. I'm like, oh, okay, this is also why it's so important is like, managers actually have more impact on an employee's well-being and mental health than their therapist or doctor.
Oh,
So
that's
it's like
interesting.
if you have a really bad people leader, like
Mhm.
it can crush you as an employee,
Yeah.
like really crush you. And while you may
Mhm.
not see the results on the revenue right away, um, you will see it as their
Yeah.
product productivity goes down, and then it becomes like this toxic, kind
Yeah.
of swirly, whirlpool that
Mhm.
can happen. And that one was by like the Workforce Institute at UKG, and that's one thing to really remember. Even though you might be
Yeah.
early on, if you're in growth mode, even if you're just 30 employees, right? Like you're managing
Mhm.
people, and like that's the kind of that the number 3 fundamentals like that we can easily forget is just how
Mhm.
impactful we can be on those employees and their mental
Yeah.
health.
Yeah. It's a very surprising statistic, but it makes sense as soon as soon as you hear it, because so much of our lives are spent at work, and especially at early stage companies, people are often putting in more than, just a 40-hour work week. But
Mhm.
that is that is so interesting. And yeah, there would be just like the loss of immediate productivity, like while you're sitting in your seat. Because if you're having to like emotionally gear up to go
Yeah.
into a meeting, or you're getting messages that are throwing you off throughout the day or something, that's going to affect how you work. But also just like the amount of turnover that comes, like people, especially at a startup, like when a lot of the um, when a lot of the potential rewards kind of exist in a future state, and if your day to day is miserable because people are managing you poorly, like that equation's not going to work for most people, and just high turnover rates can be so detrimental to the efficiency of a company. So
Yeah.
that's
Personally,
fascinating. What are some of the skills that like you would say are like on the EQ side of things when it comes to managing people, are like, if you had to, if you could do
yeah.
like learn nothing else, you need to have this skill or something.
Okay. Learn nothing else. I don't know if it's a skill, but I'll say it's funny. It's like you really have to look internally to understand how you show up best.
Mm,
And I think as any leader, whether you're startup or growth, you should know what your guiding principles are as a leader. So,
mm,
like, what do you specifically fundamentally believe in, expect of people? what should people expect of you and will see in you? Because there's one part of like, you should be able to also be held accountable of like, okay, I'm making this statement that this is
Mhm.
important to me, and how I'm telling you this is how I'm going to show up for you. And if I'm not, you should be able to tell me, right? Like,
Mm.
to be able to evolve that. So I think if there's any one thing that will help you also with your EQ is actually to understand you. Like, why is it
Mhm.
that you think like this must be done this way? And really ask yourself, I equate it to like 5-year-olds are the best teachers because like they ask questions, like a ton of questions. And it's just
Mhm.
to figure out and understand. There's no like preconceived notion like I'm gonna prove you wrong or
Right.
like I'm better than you or any of that, right? And so I think that's where it's like, okay, why is that? Why is that so important to me? Did I have a previous experience and I understand that? And to really connect it so that you literally could write down what are your leadership guiding principles.
Mhm.
And then as you grow as a leader, revisit that each time to say, like, is this still true? Or do I
Mhm.
need to add to it? Do I need to add to that or expand on it? And I've seen leaders actually show up with them of like, this is here, team. This is what to expect from me,
Oh.
and encouraging them to write their own because they're them as team members. What should we all expect from each other? I think that's really a fundamental. Like, if there's one thing we should all do, if we don't already have a draft somewhere, is
Mhm.
what our leadership principles are.
That's so interesting. I mean, I feel like that demands a certain amount of vulnerability from a leader to say like, this is who I want to be and who I'm going to show up to, and you can hold me accountable to it. Like, I don't. That's got to be difficult for
Yeah,
a
you
lot
you
of
can
leaders
you
to
can
put
get
themselves
there.
there.
Yeah, I'm like, you
Mhm.
can get there. I think the first step is, like, be vulnerable with yourself. You don't have to share it
Mm.
with anybody, but know it for you.
Mhm.
So that when you're saying things, you're like, "Okay, it's because of this, like, this I already talked about this to myself," and be
Mhm.
comfortable with what it is for you first.
Mhm.
And then over time, you'll see that it shows up so much in the work that you do that it will feel easy to just share it and show it.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I love it's not dissimilar to how you kinda map out, like, values for, an organization or something, and having values or kind of directives of, this is who I am, this is how I show up in the world, or how I want to make it aspirational. Like, it's
Yeah.
powerful, I think, for a leader.
And I think it helps you connect with what your vision is too. And
Mhm.
then if you can imagine like having your team members, even if it's just internally themselves, going through that same exercise, but then you're actually able to have them draw back the line of like, how is it that my skill sets, my principles, what I'm good at, what I feel great doing, how does that help with where our mission is, what our vision is, what we're
Mm.
trying to objectively achieve on the outcomes and the results? Then there is definitely much more of an attachment of like, okay, this is the train that I want to be on. I'm excited to be on, and that
Mm.
I want to see us to get to that next station and that next station. Like, that's how you can build towards that.
So I'm trying to remember. I know we've hit on at least 3 of
Wait,
the
okay, we have the
4
fourth one.
things.
That's
Yeah, I was trying to remember if EQ is, like, the 4th one or the 3rd one, but I'm dying to
yeah.
hear the
I
last
feel
one.
like so this fourth one, having been on enough startups, it's like a dirty word, process.
Okay.
Okay. But there is this whole idea, like process can look very different, but
Mhm.
when you start to scale up, you do need some type of process management. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like an SOP for everything, but
Mhm.
a process in which that it really can fundamentally establish like, all right, what are the ground rules in which we may evaluate something, for example.
Mhm.
But having that scripted out, written out, so that nobody is just relying on someone teaching that or talking
Mhm.
about it, that they really can actually just, okay, I see it, I read it. We may review it
Yeah.
before let's say you're just evaluating different products to do next or different requirements to add or not to add, whatever
Mhm.
it may be. But starting with that basic component, and as you grow, it will necessitate larger kind of overhauls of what that
Sure.
process is. But even
Mhm.
in the very beginning, just like very simple, here's the 3 things we're going to look for. and making sure that it's written out so that everybody actually knows about. Like
Yeah.
that's where, it used to be super simple. We could say, are we going to do it? Okay, sure. Let's just do it.
Hmm.
And it does become more complex, but to ensure that kind of all the fundamental things are carried through, you do
Hmm.
need a process. Like,
Yeah.
I remember one time there was like early on, we're trying to just grow sales, and the sales team just took it as like, okay, we're just going to get more accounts. Like we just need to get more accounts.
Hmm.
And it wasn't fully clear until later though that the focus is actually like getting revenue, like,
Mm.
so it's like, oh wow, if had we actually thought about and said like,
Yeah.
here's the 3 criteria of growing an account, right? Like that actually would
Hmm.
have been a great way to manage that process and the criteria with what the actions would take and how that would be implemented out with that, the sales team. And you can see that with many other different types of departments and teams in that sense.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it even it reminds me of, I think it was the very first kind of like framework that you were talking about. Because if people are like, if people absorb knowledge differently, even just having something documented is going to be so useful for some people on teams where like you can have a meeting, you could have 6 meetings, and they might not like absorb it if they don't have something like documented somewhere that they can refer back to. Even to your point, if it's not, this exhaustive document or something, just having something that is a reference point can be, yeah, so useful.
Yeah, well, I mean, because you're gonna run out of time, like, you're not going to
Mhm,
have it like, when the team was smaller, you might have been able to do one-on-one more thoroughly, do any of the onboarding and training, but the reality of as you grow is you do need to start prioritizing what things can be. I mean,
mhm,
as we do with technology, right? Like, what are the things that we can offload that actually help us be more efficient from that end,
mhm.
but still provide the adequate level of information, know-how to get someone started so they don't feel fully that they're flailing and things like that. So,
Yeah. I will say even too, like, getting a process of having things documented in the place where documentation goes, that can even be an
well, even
obstacle.
deciding what documentation you're going to use, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think
I feel
that
like I know so many organizations are straddling like 6 different things because every other week something else was decided of like, we're gonna adopt this software and then this software and this software. And people are like, I don't know where to find anything. And you're like, it's out there. The
yeah. Well, I
process is
think
out there. But
then that part, not great, right? Because then we go
yeah,
back to that other fundamental of just, like, knowledge.
yeah.
It gets lost from that. So I think I've yeah, so many companies go through that, and I think it
Hmm.
is, like, understanding what you're using and why, and then
Hmm.
understanding the user. So in essence, like, your employees become the user, the customer, trying to figure out, is that the right place that they're navigating towards or not?
Hmm.
In consolidating, because it is very hard then to get that, whether it be vision or process or any bit of knowledge, really shared, but also like grounded and embodied in people when it's
Hmm.
in like 10 different places. And you
Yeah,
may have someone who only looks maybe in one or two, or like
yeah,
half looks. Like I've been guilty of like half looking at stuff because I'm like, I might have
yeah.
seen it come across like on a subject heading or something. So I
Hmm.
think it's about, like, so I think that's where
Yeah,
it's just the communication and the knowledge sharing is so important. Otherwise, like, yeah, any of this,
yeah,
it's not gonna work.
yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I think we're just about at time. So any final parting words you wanted to share on the topic? This has been a great conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think, know what your fundamentals are yourself, because that really does impact how you show up as a leader and a continuously like growing leader, leading the business, but also growing yourself. And then, yeah, don't forget that the surprising fundamental four that kind of can surprise you in a negative way if you're not really looking at working backwards with it, like process management, those people dynamics, like we have so much impact, and the knowledge flow. And at the end of the day, like the decision making, those are all kind of things that change as we start to
Mhm.
accelerate.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on here with us, Elaine,
Thanks for
today. This has
having
been
me.
great. All right. All right. Well, thanks to anyone who was able to join and anyone who's watching this recording. Tune in next week for our next series in the Growth Accelerator. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.